Akshata Murthy is the billionaire wife of Chancellor Rishi Sunak, and she's been in the press a fair amount recently. First, it emerged that the company she part-owned, called Infosys, was doing business in Russia even after her husband had called for companies to withdraw. Now, it's emerged she's signed up to a scheme which allows her to avoid tax on her international income. That, of course, includes the estimated £12 million she made from Infosys last year. That's right, the wealthy wife of the man who tells you how much tax to pay doesn't pay any UK tax on millions of pounds of her income. This is all possible because Akshata Murthy has non-dom status. This means that while she resides in the UK and indeed lives in a state-owned house, for most tax purposes, she is counted as being domiciled elsewhere. Simply put, being a non-dom means the money you make abroad stays abroad, and the British state has nothing to do with it. To enjoy the privileges of being a non-dom, someone must show they are a permanent resident of a foreign country to which they plan to return. And they also have to pay the Treasury an annual fee of £30,000. For Murthy, this was a financial no-brainer, The Guardian report. Murthy has collected £54.5 million in dividends from Infosys since 2015, the earliest date for which the relevant information is available. Had she been paying UK tax on that income, she would have been liable for as much as 20 million. So this was very financially advantageous for her, to say the least, or at least according to those Guardian estimates. It is, of course, important to note that by gaining non-dom status, Murthy has done nothing illegal. It's allowed under UK tax law to live in Britain full-time and use Britain's public services, all while paying absolutely zero tax on what's likely your main source of income. But just because something is legal, that doesn't mean it's moral. And this whole story most certainly stinks. In the wake of the revelation, Sunak gave an interview to The Sun. As you can see from this headline, he's dismissed the charges as a smear, apparently truthfully talking about his wife's tax status should be off limits. He did nonetheless try to defend her, saying every single penny that she earns in the UK she pays UK taxes on. Of course she does. And every penny that she earns internationally, for example in India, she would pay the full taxes on that. That is how the system works for people like her who are international, who have moved here. Now, this is an interesting claim because Murthy's non-dom status doesn't necessarily mean she will be paying tax in India. If she were, she would still be saving money. Tax on dividends in India are 20%, while they would be 39.5% in Britain for someone in her situation. But it's also possible Murthy could be saving even more. That's because it's still unconfirmed whether her Infosys dividends are registered in India or elsewhere. As a non-dom, Murthy could just as easily have registered in a tax haven like Monaco or the Cayman Islands and pay zero tax on the dividends she receives each year. And it's worth noting, Murthy is no stranger to tax havens. In 2020, The Guardian reported that Murthy owned 5% of International Market Management, a company which planned to build dozens of restaurants across India. But they discovered that the business was not registered where those restaurants would be. Rather, they were registered in Mauritius. The Guardian at the time reported, after reviewing the IMM structure, experts from the Indian Revenue Service and the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, a campaign group, concluded the arrangement could reduce the taxes payable on any profits in India by setting up letterbox companies in Mauritius, essentially shell companies with no staff and no trading activity. Investors can channel money from Indian businesses to the tax haven. Investments routed through Mauritius are estimated to have cost India between $10 billion and $15 billion over the last 20 years in lost capital gains, dividends tax, and tax on interest and royalty payments. I'm sure, as you can imagine, Akshata Murthy will say in response to that, I only own 5%, I don't have any control over this business. We've heard that before. We've heard that before when it came to Infosys in Russia. She ended up doing a U-turn because obviously these things do matter, whether or not you are the CEO of that company. According to the BBC, it's worth noting, Labour have written to the Chancellor asking him to confirm where Murthy is registered for tax purposes. Is it India? Is it a tax haven? Is it America? He's yet to respond. And this is by no means the fishiest part of the defence from the Sunaks. When the story first broke, this was the response from Akshata Murthy's spokesperson. Akshata Murthy is a citizen of India, the country of her birth and parents' home. India does not allow its citizens to hold the citizenship of another country simultaneously. So according to British law, Ms Murthy is treated as non-domiciled for UK tax purposes. She has always and will continue to pay UK taxes on all her UK income. The implication there is that Murty is automatically a non-dom because she has Indian citizenship, and that she could only stop being a non-dom if she gave it up. It was a line which Rishi Sunak repeated in an interview with The Sun. He said, "It wouldn't be reasonable or fair to ask her to sever ties with her country because she happens to be married to me. She loves her country like I love mine. I would never dream of giving up my British citizenship, and I imagine most people wouldn't." Now that all sounds extremely reasonable, extremely honourable even. The problem, it's complete nonsense. As explained by the BBC, non-dom is a description of tax status and has nothing to do with one's chosen nationality, citizenship, or resident status, although it can be affected by these factors in the sense that it can be easier to qualify for these things if you've got citizenship elsewhere. The crux, though, there, the significant bit there, being a non-dom has nothing to do with where someone is from, and multiple tax experts have explained Murty could choose to pay UK tax on her entire income without that having any effect whatsoever on her ability to retain her Indian citizenship or to return to India in the future. And that all means, and this is pretty significant, we can only conclude either Rishi Sunak, who is, of course, in charge of our tax system, has no idea how our tax system works, or the man is lying. You decide which one you think is most likely. While you do that, let's go to some of the political reactions.
I think it's very important in politics, if you possibly can, to try to keep people's families out of it. What I will say is that Rishi and I are working very hard on a massive long-term British energy security strategy. That's what we're focused on.
That was Boris Johnson, who won't confirm how many children he's had, saying we should keep families out of politics. And obviously, that supposed principle makes even less sense when it comes to money than it does with, say, infidelity. A person's income affects their entire household, which is why the Ministerial Code requires a minister to declare their partner's financial affairs, and why HMRC asks how much your partner earns when they decide whether or not you qualify for benefits. Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, was equally unconvincing.
How does it look to the British public that while they're being asked to pay more tax from yesterday, the wife of the man who is asking us to do that is earning millions from overseas investments and not paying a penny?
So I looked at her statement yesterday. She made it very clear that as an Indian national, she can't have dual citizenship. And she's got a non-dom status here in the UK.
As we've already mentioned, Murty's citizenship does not mean she has to be a non-dom. And so the business secretary joins the Chancellor in not understanding how the British tax system works. Someone who does understand, though, is Ed Miliband.
There are lots and lots of people, Kay, who are citizens of other countries, not UK citizens, but who pay taxes here. You don't have to be a non-dom. You don't have to be a non-dom. You're not forced to be it. You choose to do it. In fact, you pay a little bit of money up front, or quite a lot of money actually up front. Yeah, quite a lot of money up front to get to be non-dom status, and it's to save you money, in your overall tax bill. Look, I think there are legitimate questions that need to be asked of Rishi Sunak about this.
And Keir Starmer wasn't buying the line that the Chancellor's wife shouldn't be scrutinised.
Everybody is struggling with the cost of living crisis. The prices are through the roof, wages are through the floor. The Chancellor has chosen to increase taxes. There's no argument to say that those who've had their tax increase aren't entitled even to know if the Chancellor's family himself are taking or making use of schemes to reduce their own tax burden. That isn't about attacking anybody. It's about basic accountability, basic transparency, basic fairness for those that are facing a real struggle with their family finances.
And if he or his family have taken advantage of those tax arrangements, should he resign?
Well, we need to look at the answers that he gives. At the moment, this is not complicated. There are simple questions. We need simple answers from the Chancellor and his family.
Barnaby, your comments on Akshata Murty's tax status.
Well, they pay £30,000 to avoid £20 million in taxes for the public services the rest of us use. Let's just remember how this couple, Sunak and Murty, spend some of that money. They were recently featured in the magazine of Winchester, an elite private school that Rishi Sunak attended, being celebrated as part of a small club of people who'd given more than £100,000 to that school. So money that could have gone to state schools struggling now for funds is kept from those schools, from those public services, and instead the billionaire and her husband give it to their favorite elite private school. That payment to avoid tax legally is a political choice. The same governments who chase every penny in tax and benefits for working class people sign sweetheart deals with companies like Amazon and Google to avoid tax bills. And then they carve out a special category for billionaires, and most UK billionaires use it to protect their wealth from tax. So every pound lost this way to the NHS and to our schools has to be paid by someone else, or we all pay the price in struggling public services, so that non-dom status is a kind of special fund for the super rich, established by the state and extending right into the home of the man responsible for our taxes, a man who spends his money helping institutions that exist to perpetuate privilege. Do you remember the row over second jobs for MPs? The people who write the laws that took 20 quid a week from families on universal credit protested that their 80k a year wasn't enough, so they needed to take on lucrative lobbying work, poisoning democracy. And the double standard was insulting, to watch MPs on our TV screens explain they just had to work in lucrative second jobs because they couldn't survive on 80k while taking money from the very poorest. Well, now the Chancellor finds every excuse for his wife to store tens of millions in unpaid tax, while most adults on benefits are in working households and punished immediately if they take on a bit of extra work. But here there's also an added dimension to the double standard, which is that Sunak asks our sympathy for foreigners when it's his billionaire wife, while refugees are banned from working and pushed into destitution. So one striking feature of class society is a kind of moral relativism, where we're invited to judge the greed or the violence of the powerful with sensitivity and sympathy, not to leap into knee-jerk anger, but to find the nuances and understand. But the actions of the poor are suspected and harassed and punished like criminal runts who understand only force. That's the kind of offensive double standard at work here.
The defense that's made about, look, you might find this distasteful, but this was all above board. She didn't break any laws. The response to that is probably, well, we should change those laws. And then the response to that is, maybe it's going to be harder to change those laws where the guy in charge of those laws, the guy who runs the Treasury, is married to someone benefiting from them. That's why the conflict of interest really, really matters here, because this is a bad law which should be changed. And I think having someone in 11 Downing Street who's benefiting from that bad law, that's not a great situation to be in. We're going to talk a bit more about this story, and especially what I think has been most embarrassing is probably the Tories' incredibly crude weaponization of identity politics to defend this multimillionaire avoiding or paying English tax on some of her income. This was Energy Minister Greg Hands speaking to Radio 4.
I think I'm saying that that some of the commentary around this has been a bit unpleasant. I think some of the sort of attacks on her for being a slight implication that there's something not right about her being a foreign national. And that I find, and my wife is a foreign national, I find that aspect of things a little bit unpleasant myself.
Of course, no one has a problem with Akshata Murphy being a foreign national. We have an issue with her choosing to take on non-dom status. It's a choice. It has nothing to do with where she's from. Sunak himself also intimated towards the racism angle, telling The Sun, people, I don't think, have an issue with the fact that there's an Indian woman living in Downing Street. I would hope that most fair-minded people would understand, though I appreciate that it is a confusing situation that she is from another country. Mate, it's not a confusing situation that she's from another country. No one is confused. No one's like, oh, it's really confusing. Rishi Sunak's wife is Indian. I can't grasp that. How could that, what a confusing situation. Rishi Sunak's got an Indian wife. No one is confused. What's confusing is that the Chancellor doesn't know how the tax system works in the country where he is in charge of the tax system. That's the confusing part. No one is confused that your wife is from another country. How ridiculous and patronizing. While some have implied Murty's critics are xenophobic, others have gone for the sexism angle. Foreign Minister James cleverly tweeted, I really thought that we had moved on from the notion that wives are merely an extension of their husbands. Seems that Labour didn't get that memo. And there was a great reply to this that got a lot of retweets from a Twitter user called Sarah. So when a man is made redundant, I assume you won't be looking at his wife's income anymore when deciding if he can claim benefits. The absolute hypocrisy of all of this. When it's their rich and powerful friends, they say, oh, how dare you ask someone how much their wife earns or ask a wife how much their husband earns. This is exactly what the benefits and tax system does all the time. If you're on benefits and your partner gets a pay rise, You have to tell HMRC. If you don't, you might well get a fine. You'll probably have to pay back a load of money. It'll be very financially difficult for you. But when it comes to the rich and powerful, no. You can't say, when the HMRC says, what's the joint income of your household? You can't fill out that form and say, oh, I'm not going to tell you that. My wife's income has nothing to do with my income and my income has nothing to do with hers. Let's move on to some more recent developments. There have been some. After an initial leak to Sky, Rishi Sunak has confirmed that he held a US green card for the first year and 7 months of his chancellorship. The Independent had an entertaining write-up of the significance of this. Holders of the green card are required to file US tax returns on their worldwide income and also to make a legal commitment to make the US your permanent home. The pledge would seemingly be at odds with Mr. Sunak's position as Chancellor of the United Kingdom, being a member of Parliament since 2015 and Minister since 2018, and the fact that he lives on Downing Street. That does seem rather odd, doesn't it? It's difficult to square that with being a permanent resident of the United States. Akshata Murthy also held a green card and may still do. She hasn't confirmed either way. An interesting twist here is that the US doesn't have the equivalent of non-dom status, and therefore holding a green card would have required the Sunaks to pay tax on their worldwide income to the US. Sunak's spokesperson said, all laws and rules have been followed and full taxes have been paid where required in the duration he held his green card. Rishi Sunak followed all guidance and continued to file US tax returns, but specifically as a non-resident in full compliance with the law. Were Sunak and his wife happy to pay tax to the US on their international earnings, but not to the UK where they live and where he's a very senior politician in the government who actually makes rules on tax? Boris Johnson has since said that he didn't know about Murthy's non-dom status, so I expect the next controversy to be whether Johnson is lying, wouldn't be a surprise, or if not, why Sunak kept this information back from his boss. That also wouldn't be a surprise. I have one more update for you as well. This broke while we were live. According to the BBC, Murthy has said she will now pay UK tax on her overseas income, so presumably giving up her non-dom status. She said she doesn't want her financial affairs to be a distraction for her husband. Now, the obvious question here, Murthy, according to your spokesperson, the reason you couldn't stop being a non-dom, the reason you couldn't pay UK tax on your international earnings is because then you'd have to give up your Indian citizenship. Unless you learned something since Wednesday and now, either you were lying then or you've suddenly decided, oh, actually, I don't really want my Indian citizenship after all. She could have paid tax for the past 7 years.
It's a striking double standard that extends the class double standard of MPs bleating that they need second jobs because 80k isn't enough to live on, while they take money in a desperately needed uplift to universal credit they remove from many, many people. We get now the extension of that into a kind of culture war where the same politicians who attack migrants, who leave migrants to drown in the Channel, then tell us who are worried about money lost to our public services that we have a problem with people not born in Britain. It is, of course, macabre. But this isn't just a kind of gossip story about a famous couple. When Rishi Sunak sits down at his desk, he has the British economy to manage. Whose interests are at the front of his mind? That's the question. Who does he care about? Who does he represent? Who does he have to face that evening at cocktail parties and at the opera and smile as he reassures them that he has their back? Well, he gives over 100k to Winchester School, so that gives you some idea. We hear a lot about the death of class, but the British ruling class feels more organic solidarity with one another than anyone else I've ever met. They defend one another as if their wealth depends on it, because it does depend on it. That's the story here. It's about class, just like Partygate was. And there's an irony there. Sunak's stock rose during Partygate because at least he didn't seem like the reckless party type. And now Johnson may be leaking this to undermine him as a future Tory leader, but they're all the same. Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson call themselves low-tax conservatives, and they've managed tax increases in 2 years as big as New Labour managed in 10, tax rises worth 2% of GDP. They've given us the highest tax burden in 70 years. And in March, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS, warned next month will mark the beginning of a steep ascent in the path of UK taxation. That was a month ago. The special thing about this crisis is that most of those tax rises fall on the less well-off, like the national insurance hike, and that the excuse is that we have an emergency of a pandemic, which was a genuine, massive crisis. But their blinkered austerity ideology means they want to pass on the cost of that crisis quickly to most people in the form of tax rises, which no other major European country is doing as steadily. So we face here a group of people who know what class they represent and who respond to a crisis, never let a crisis go to waste, by ensuring that other people, not them, pay the price for it.
We've got another breaking story, quote from The Independent. Trusts in the British Virgin Islands and Cayman Islands, created to help manage the tax and business affairs of his wife Akshata Murthy's family interests, note Mr. Sunak as a beneficiary in 2020, according to people familiar with Ms. Murthy's financial affairs and evidence reviewed by this publication. So this was, of course, while he was Chancellor, and he was a beneficiary of something based in a tax haven. I love this. People familiar with Ms. Murthy's financial affairs. I would love to be someone familiar with Ms. Murthy's financial affairs right now. Although I suppose we all are now becoming ever more familiar with them. Hopefully more so. I'm sure there's a lot in there. When you've got that much money, it gets quite complicated, you know. Got a feel for these people. It's not easy having that much money.